around the world. And so I'm really excited that we had a student step into a leadership position and bring this together. The composition of the panel today is going to include Archer as our student moderating. We're going to have public, private sector, and academia sort of engaged all in this discussion up front. And so I'll briefly introduce Archer Amen, who will be your host today as soon as we get off the stage. Archer is a triple major. I've not met many triple majors in my time. I've met a few double majors, but never a triple major, especially a triple major that crosses the seams between the hard and soft sciences. And so Archer is a computer science major, international relations major, and a political science major, right? So you can see there's brilliance there for sure. And in addition to taking this incredibly robust academic pathway, Archer is also one of our incredible resilient students in our Model UN program, which he's incredibly well representing the university in sort of major national fora that parse these issues out from a global perspective. And so kick off just a few thoughts about the Green School of International Public Affairs. And so while we took on this AI and democracy piece, the institute that I represent focuses a lot on things like cyber policy, AI regulation, discussions around the policy, regulatory, and sort of soft side of the tech. We don't do a whole lot of ones and zeros, as we like to say when we sort of talk about policy issues. So we focus a lot on the tech side. And we partnered with the Green School of International Public Affairs, which has an incredibly important thread within the democracy side. And so the Green School has been an incredible convening space for critical conversations among key actors that really focus on the social sciences, particularly around the issues of democracy. And so various units at the Green School, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, our Havel Center for Democracy, our Eurasia program, all have worked hard to make democracy one of the major threads in the discourse of the school. And so we're really excited about that. And for the past few years, the Green School has held its Miami Conference on Global Democracy, a gathering of international experts exploring the contemporary issues around democratic backsliding. And that is exactly where Archer had the sort of vision for this in focusing on that seam between technology and democracy. And as we talk through this today, on one hand, we talk about the benefits of AI. Obviously, a lot of people talk about the surge of or the extinction of our species as a result of the rise of machines. I don't tend to have that same thinking, of course. There's a lot of incredibly powerful impacts, tectonic shifts even, that are at play as we start to see incredible integrations of these technologies across all of society. So on one hand, you have sort of AI expanding things like citizen participation, the flow of information. It's creating efficiencies in governance, and so there's lots of pros that we're starting to see already, with the integration of AI. But at the same time, we talk about some of the challenges associated with AI, the rise of deepfakes, other issues in terms of how autocratic leaders may be able to leverage these sophisticated technologies to continue to repress, monitor, maintain strict control over their respective societies. And so today's discussion is probably going to be fairly broad across a wide range of issues at that seam between democracy and AI. But before we kick it over to Archer, I'm going to invite we wanted to bring some star power from Miami. So I brought, I'm going to call him out here. So the front cover of Global Miami, just this, am I embarrassing you, Saif? Saif Ashouf, a dear friend, an incredible champion of the university, the CEO and founder of Lab 22C, that's 22nd Century, is going to be our keynote. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about where his vision is in terms of the power of AI being unlocked in contemporary societies. And so with that, Saif, I welcome you up to the front.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Brian. And before I share some insight, I want to appreciate we're here at a learning institution, and the magic happens because of students. And let's give another shout out to Archer for leadership and bringing us together. So I have the unusual task of setting a little bit of the stage for what is going to be a range of thoughtful conversations on this hefty topic of AI, democracy, and really the future of our country. And I couldn't be more excited for the conversation that my friend and colleague Alex Crowther is going to moderate with some really distinguished scholars and practitioners in the field. My presentation is a little bit different, only because the work that I get to do now, as Brian mentioned, is I get to spend a lot of time in the private sector with earlier stage companies that are building in real time in and around a lot of these frontier technologies. And so for the purposes of our conversation today, I wanted to start with this idea of something that is akin to a new social contract, which is at the intersection of AI, democracy, and what I would call the race for our future. And you can't get started in any conversation like this without a little bit of tongue-in-cheek energy and thinking about the issue topic of 2024, any which way you look at it, is definitely around AI. And so you have to think in terms of meme culture, and we all know, if you're a Swiftie, any Swifties in here? Okay, like if you're not, then you can actually excuse yourself from the room, because we won't welcome you here. Now, jokes aside, we know there's a famous Taylor Swift lyric that starts, "Hi, it's me, I'm the problem, it's me." And that essentially could be AI and machine learning and all the affiliated technologies staring at us as really the motto for 2024. And it's certainly flooding all of our social media feeds, it's flooding all of our informational news channels. And I think that for each one of us, we come with a unique vantage point around how we look at the opportunity and the problem set that's out there. But I think one thing is for sure, at this exact moment in history, future historians will look back at this as one of the biggest tests on not just technology, but also our democracy. Probably the greatest stress test of our democracy since World War II. And it's not only that it's testing our democratic institutions, it's also fundamentally reshaping them. And keeping within the vein of memes, I like to think a lot about how this moment actually feels against the backdrop of some of our favorite movies. So how many of you in here are Marvel movie fans? You like Marvel movies, right? Got it, right? And for all of us, when we think about Marvel movies, the best part of any Marvel movie is actually the post-credit scene. The post-credit scene sets the stage for everything that's going to come next. It gives you, maybe they've defeated Thanos, maybe they're thinking about how it is they're going to unite the Infinity Stones, all of these types of things. You're sitting in the shawarma shop, having a shawarma or falafel with Thor and Iron Man, and it's really the setup for everything that's about to come. And I think that in many regards, the battle or a lot of the back and forth that we see within our society and in the public sector around AI and frontier technologies, we are now sitting in the proverbial shawarma shop with Thor, trying to think about where do things go from here. And to stay a moment within the vein of the Marvel Comics universe, we also want to think about something that we know is often stated as somewhat one of the maxims of technology. And so we know the founder of A16Z, Mark Andreessen, who's the creator of one of the first internet browsers, has a line that he says, "Software is eating the world." And we know as a corollary to that, the element of software that's really devouring, what's devouring software is artificial intelligence. So that's kind of the essence of where I wanted to start. But I wanted to push us a little bit deeper into a couple of different constructs that I think we don't necessarily oftentimes address when we think about where we are right now. And the first big idea that I want to put on the table is what I call the power paradox. The power paradox. And when we think about it, we're witnessing essentially the largest concentration of computational power in human history being amassed. And we think about the amount of money that's being expended on it. Microsoft announced an effort to spend almost $50 billion in AI infrastructure, with a commitment as well from OpenAI, $10 billion. Oracle is planning $8 billion in computational capacity. And these companies are building infrastructure that rivals the power consumption of small nations. So when you realize that a single LLM can cost upwards of 100 million in computer resources alone, you begin to understand the scale that we're dealing with. And to be clear, our current technological advantage isn't guaranteed. While we debate AI regulation, India is producing more engineers annually than the United States and China combined. And this isn't about simply competing alone with China alone anymore. New AI superpowers could emerge from any one of those nations that's able to combine computational resources, engineering talent, strategic vision, and cheap energy. So our democratic advantage in this revolution is not a birthright. It's actually something that we have to every single day make affirmative decisions that we want to be in the game. And this brings it right back to the idea of our democracy, right? So I, of course, use like everybody an image generator to think about like all these different things. You got all these things smashed together in one image. You've got nuclear power, you've got solar power, you've got data centers, you've got wind power. And I was born in the country of Guyana, so I said put all of that in Guyana, which could wind up becoming essentially the Saudi Arabia or Qatar of the Western Hemisphere as far as the production of hydrocarbons. So, all of these things come together and converge as one. And we know that AI's energy is staggering. That's the consumption is staggering. That's the reason why I start with this idea of the power paradox, because a lot of our geopolitics will link right back to that. It's not only about countries and places on our planet that have a major edge as far as engineering talent. A lot of people are going to start to think about it. Where do you have an energy hedge? Where is there a better spread around cheaper, more efficient energy? I referenced Guyana. Recently, massive oil reserves. And who controls these energy resources ultimately has a linkage point to who controls the future of AI capabilities, creating a whole new confluence of geopolitical pressures on young democracies. And while we debate and discuss things like AI regulation, we're not addressing only energy politics and AI computing needs. We also have to think about how this will reshape democracies worldwide. And I know in a moment we're going to wind up having a more deep, thorough discussion around things like the recent White House memo that just came out last week, October 24th, 2024, acknowledging this concentration of power and calling for a balance between innovation and security. But between the lines, there's a crucial question. How do we democratize not only AI's benefits, but its very infrastructure? Where is the citizenry lobby around these issue topics? Or are the only decision makers ones that are safeguarding, on one end, national security, and then on the other end, massive technology companies that want to be determinative of what this framework should look like? Where is the everyday voice? Where is essentially, for those of you who are old school enough, the Ralph Nader type viewpoint? Where is the 2024, 2025 version of that with respect to these issue topics in our state's capitals, in our nation's capital around it? So if we think about it, our state legislatures around the country are rushing to pass legislation on these issue topics. California's SB 1047 represents one of the most comprehensive attempts. But here's a troubling question. Do our lawmakers understand the power of this technology that they're trying to regulate? And like I asked before, where's the citizen voice around it? So, I actually thought, I had a question. Oh, clicker's not working. There we go. So, pop quiz. How many United States senators have computer science degrees? Zero. Okay. How many members of Congress have computer science degrees?
One.
3. So we think about now is that a prerequisite necessarily for sounding in on these issue topics? At some level, definitely yes. I love my barber, but I don't want my barber sounding in on brain surgery policies. Even though he does work around my brain, he's not actually equipped to sound in on this. And I think that it gets even deeper and weirder when you think about how complex these constructs are. Because how many of you remember, and I know Pedro would because now he's at Meta, although I don't know if you were there then, but there's that famous original hearing where you have Chuck Grassley, senator, and Mark Zuckerberg sitting there, right? Zuckerberg gets called to the mat by the senators, and there's that famous exchange between them. I'm going to get back to that one. Between them. There it is, right? And Senator Grassley asked Zuckerberg, how do you make money? And he's like, Senator, we run ads, right? That is in many regards a proxy on a discussion around like regulation of social media, right? Relatively an easier thing to understand, not easy by any means, around the deficit in understanding between our regulatory bodies, our sort of democratically represented, elected representatives on something that's actually much easier to think about, right, conceptually, and yet this framework in many regards has not changed at all as far as who are the folks that are asking the questions and then who are the people that are building the technology. You actually have accelerated that much further on the builders of this technology, and you've actually gone further back in time when you consider something like we have 0 United States senators with a degree in computer science. So that exchange might be a meme, but it revealed something more profound. If our senior lawmakers struggled to understand the basic business model of Facebook at that time, how can we expect them to effectively regulate something as complex as artificial intelligence? And unlike social media, we don't have the luxury of waiting years to figure a lot of this stuff out. I oftentimes, and it's funny being in a space like a university, as somebody who's now back in the private sector, I think that when we think about these constructs, we have to think a lot less like a think tank and think a little bit more like a Shark Tank, fast-moving, practical, and focused on real outcomes. And many times people will say, well, oh, did you read this policy paper? And we realize that in an attention economy, policy papers pile up. While people like Mr. Beast are reaching more and more young people with AI content in a single video than most government awareness campaigns will in an entire year. And we need to think about that type of dynamism in our democratic approach to AI. And what I see, and I think many of us realize, is that there is emerging what could be called a computational democracy gap. The growing distance between those who understand and control AI systems and those who live with their consequences. So I had an opportunity to serve the mayor of Miami as his innovation advisor in my last chapter when I was at FIU because my then boss, President Rosenberg. And we started early on to think about questions that are unresolved. For example, body camera footage that police capture, right? We know that it's something that's part of the mandate to make sure protection and safety of the citizenry and also the law enforcement officers. Big question, can cities data mine body camera video footage to then determine whether or not Alex has a parking ticket? The answer is that it's unresolved. That data exists. Somebody could throw an algorithm at it and actually mine it for all kinds of other unintended consequences. So we begin to realize that we don't really have democratic consensus or understanding about where a lot of this stuff is ultimately going to lie. And this isn't just a theoretical concern. Cities across America are beginning to make very, very deep decisions about all of this. And I think that this is what brings us to the core tensions in a lot of what we saw in the recent White House AI memo. How we balance this innovation with democratic insight. I don't know how many of you saw the recent cover of The Economist magazine. It was a really spectacular cover, and it looks like a bundle of Benjamins that's meant to look like the new SpaceX rocket, the one that they launched into space, and then they were able to bring right back down and catch in essentially a launch chopstick, right? And it said, the essence of, if you read that particular issue of The Economist, was that American innovation is unstoppable. That we are so many standard deviations ahead of everybody else as far as progress and prosperity that there isn't even a close second or third or fourth, right? So we begin to realize that we also find ourselves in a place where we're starting to create, almost like in a Cold War-like era, these false binaries, right? You've got on one end, right, what are called the E-accelerationists, effective accelerationists, right? You know, best embodied by somebody like Sam Altman, right? Who are saying like, just build, just build and it just do whatever needs to be done. And then on the other end, we've got somebody who's called the godfather of AI, Dr. Geoffrey Hinton, who just won the Nobel Prize in Physics of all disciplines, right? And I think that if you really want to understand it, right, you got to use meme culture, the famous predator handshake that happened between Carl Weathers and Arnold Schwarzenegger. But of course, if you beef it up for the AI era, being bad at drawing hands, and then effective accelerationist and the AI art generators. You look at the fingers, it's all crumbled up, right? We're in this moment where we start to also have these false choices that get presented in front of us, right? Mark Andreessen wrote this famous techno-optimist manifesto to argue that any attempt to slow AI development is morally wrong and could cede crucial advantages in geopolitical competition. And then you've got somebody like Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, leaving Google to warn us about AI risks, comparing it to the discovery of fire, but with less time for all of us to adapt. But here's what's fascinating. That binary is completely false. It's like saying you're either for or against cars. The reality is we need traffic lights and highways, speed limits, and innovation. And oftentimes when we think about this is the discourse that we get dragged into, right? You're either on one side of an equation or the other. And when we think about this, I mean, this is just within the public square. When we start to push this into elected environments, it becomes weaponized that much more. With stakeholders that oftentimes, going back to that data point of 0 senators having degrees in computer science, where you have people who are sounding in on constructs that they don't actually have enough of a fundamental understanding about what this actually means. So this isn't about speed versus safety. It's about what I call direction and distribution of power. The White House memo gets it right partly in emphasizing both innovation and safeguards, but we need to go further in democratizing the development process itself. So I like to think about it in terms of a new democratic framework, right? Where, what would we actually need to do, right? And the new democratic framework, and I was chatting with one of our fellow attendees this morning, and I said to them, do we kind of flip on the head the Magna Carta and call this new democratic framework the Magna Coda, right? And I think it has to have a couple of core elements embedded into it. And these are more guidelines about how we think about it. First of all, we need to have distributed oversight. We need citizenry, we need the citizen voice in AI review boards at the local, state, and federal levels with real power and technical expertise, right? These aren't just advisory boards. They need to have some sort of authority to shape what deployment looks like for the delivery of the benefit of the public as a whole. That's a complex exercise. I'm not saying that this is something that can happen overnight. Second thing, and I think that this cannot be dismissed, this is the single biggest driver that will ultimately input what happens, even more so than chips. Energy democracy. Any AI governance framework must include something adjacent to energy policy. We need to have some sort of broader consensus over the computational infrastructure that powers AI. We can't simply just have rural America be where there's cheap power become flooded with data centers that then wind up becoming disruptive to the residents and the folks that live there. This means we need more transparent planning for data centers, community input on resource allocation, and also thinking about what is the environmental impact of all of this, right? Again, false binary. Think about the predator handshake. It can't just be one side or the other. There actually has to be real and active democratic discourse. And then the final thing, which I think we can all agree upon, being that we're in a university setting, something that I call computational citizenship. Just as we teach civics, we need to develop higher degrees of tech literacy as a core component and democratic competency. This isn't about turning everyone into a programmer. It's about ensuring that we're enabling more meaningful participation in AI governance decisions. And the final thing around this, before I kind of close out, is there's an idea that I talk about, which is in this age that we're in, each one of us has to understand. I had shoulder surgery a year ago, and while I was high on meds, recovering. My wife actually ordered a ping pong table, cruelest trick imaginable. So then I saw my kids and my wife and my friends playing ping pong. And I was thinking about this idea of, in this age of machines, I've got two teenage kids, one's a freshman in college, another one's a junior in high school. What is the notion that we want to leave behind for young learners and everybody in the age of machines? And I started to watch everybody play ping pong, and I'm sitting there, and I came up with this notion of we need to learn how to volley in this age of machines. We have to learn. If you ever watch a ping pong match and you see, or any sort of sport like that, table tennis, pickleball, paddle, one of the best parts as a spectator is watching the dynamic flow, the back and forth, the back and forth. So every one of us has to ask ourselves, how are we learning to volley? And I think that this idea of acquiring these computational citizenship skills means that each one of us has to actually get in the game, right? Not just simply using LLMs for the purposes of, figuring out how many US senators have computer science degrees. Actually leaning in, if you are not a coder, to toolkits that allow you to actually write code. Tools like Cursor, tools like Replit. So if you're not actually in the game, you can't be talking about a sport and then you've never actually picked up a racket and actually engaged in this endeavor. And I think that spirit is something that is needed a lot more when we start to think about it. And this I call as you have to engage in the act of playing, building, and tinkering. I do a lot of work in the Miami Tech Innovation ecosystem, so I've actually been using these tools to build a Minecraft-like game to mirror the Miami Tech Innovation ecosystem. And I'm slowly at it. I have not coded in 25 years actively, but being able to lean into these tools is teaching me the competencies to be able to do this. So I want to close with a personal story, because I know that right now we're going to get a lot deeper. We've got some subject matter experts that are going to take us right to the mountaintop to understand the challenge points that we're facing. And I think that it's important because I get to work, as I mentioned, all day with some of the world's best founders, some of the world's best venture capitalists, people who are building many, many of these technologies. But so recently I was at a dinner with several major venture capitalists that are investing in these technologies. And my son actually sent me a meme today that said, venture capitalists are just a bunch of people playing fantasy football with rich parents. So I think it's kind of right, but I have to say that it's a little bit, little fun meme culture to begin with. So I'm at this dinner, and there are all these VCs, and these are people. I had a guy lamenting to me that he's not really a player unless he has $1 billion fund. Right. By the way, $1 billion fund means that he gets a 2% per annum management fee. So you can understand what was driving that limit. And so the VC who was sitting next to me was riffing on AI, and he turned to me and he said, Saif, it's a game of kings. AI is a game of kings. Ultimately, it's only going to be 3 or 4 of us that determine the future of this whole thing, including companies like OpenAI. I said, so it's a game of kings. I said, where do the rest of us fit in this? He said, we're serfs. And I said, okay, and how are you playing the game? He said, oh, my fund just deployed $200 million into OpenAI. It's not a comment on OpenAI. It's not a comment on any one company. It could have been any one of these companies. It could have been Perplexity. It could have been Anthropic. It could have been Mistral. It could have been any one of them. But his casual response around it tells you, it haunts me. The conversation haunts me because I don't think we fully appreciate the convergence and skewing of our democratic marketplace around capital and what that all actually means around the technologies that will be delivered to us. And I think that those are the bigger questions each and every one of us should be asking. The game of kings was chess. The game of democracies must include a role for addressing AI governance. And we stand at a really crucial juncture where we must reimagine a lot of our institutions for this world. The question isn't whether AI is going to transform our democracy, it's whether we'll shape that transformation to enhance rather than erode our democratic values. And so I wanted to leave all of us with that as sort of an opening framework for where we're going. And I also wanted to invite every one of you, because sometimes we come to these types of gatherings and you're like, I heard that guy, I disagreed with him, or I agreed with him, and I wanted to stay in touch. Two things. One is a QR code. This will not take you to the CCP main page, I promise you. One will take you to LinkedIn, and the other one will take you to an email newsletter that I write to share thoughts on the type of work that me and my team get to do at Lab 22C. Brian and team, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited for the conversation.
That was excellent. We want to know where we can get one of these suits.
Okay, yes, I will share that.
Yes. I'd like to invite up our wonderful student Archer Amen, and to begin the next phase of our panel. Archer. That's yours. I'm sorry.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to attendance at this wonderful event. Saif, amazing job with the keynote. You really highlighted some excellent points. So I'm really excited to be kicking off our panel discussion. Like the others mentioned, my name's Archer Amen. I'm going to be serving as the moderator for today's event. Just as a quick overview of the way that things are going to go, we have about an hour scheduled for moderated discussion with our 4 panelists. So we're going to be asking them a variety of questions. And then we have 30 minutes scheduled for audience QA, which we'll be taking both from the live in-person as well as the live stream audience. This will be recorded as well for anyone to go back to afterwards. And we really hope that we can answer all of your questions about this amazing topic of the intersections between AI and democracy. So right now it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists that I have put together representing diverse sectors from industry, academia, governance, and more. I truly believe that these 4 people have such special and engaging voices on AI policy and governance, and I'm really excited to highlight them today. So as I read your bio, feel free, come up, take a seat, and then we can begin the panel. So firstly, we have Dr. Glenn Alexander Crowther, who is a retired U.S. Army infantry colonel and strategist with over 40 years in government service. He's currently a senior fellow at FIU's Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, where he teaches cyber operations and advises on cybersecurity in Eastern Europe and Latin America. He also serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C., and a cyber advisor for several friendly ministries in Eastern Europe and Latin America at the U.S. Institute for Security Governance. So thank you, Alex. We next have Rachel C., a lawyer specializing in AI risk management, governance, and regulatory compliance. For over 12 years, she served in the federal government, leading enforcement, policy, and digital transformation initiatives at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and National Labor Relations Board. As the EEOC Commissioner's Senior Counsel for AI and Algorithmic Bias, she led AI policy initiatives emphasizing the applicability of employment discrimination laws to the use of artificial intelligence. She's also served as the EEOC's acting executive officer, a special assistant to the chair, and their assistant general counsel for technology. Additionally, she's an accomplished classical musician with the French horn and regularly performs with orchestras in the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you, Rachel. Next, we have Pedro Pavone, Global Director of Data Monetization, Ads Privacy, and Fairness Policy at Meta, where he leads a team specializing in project counseling, compliance strategy, and public policy advocacy related to privacy, data protection, AI, and algorithmic fairness and trust. He's previously also served as Director of Global Data Protection at Salesforce and Senior Managing Counsel at Oracle. Before entering private practice, Pedro served as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General of the United States at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., Attorney Advisor and Program Manager at the U.S. Department of Energy, and Advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice in Miami. Pedro is also the host of the Data Protection Breakfast Club, which is an award-winning podcast about tech and the legal industry. Lastly, we have Iria Puyosa, a Senior Research Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Democracy and Technology Initiative, where her work examines the impact of social media on political conflicts and global information operations that undermine democracy. She previously served as an associate professor at the Central University of Venezuela and held a visiting position at Brown University's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Iria was also the 2018 through 2020 chair of the section on Venezuelan Studies in the Latin American Studies Association and is a member of the Torah Peace Institute's International Research Advisory Council, advising on social media, technology, and peace building. So please give it up for our wonderful panelists. All right, great to have you all here. So my first question, I know I just introduced a bit of your background, but there's always so much current and engaging work going on in the field of AI policy that I wanted to invite each of you to say a couple sentences about the main focus of your current work efforts, and in particular, what you would identify as the largest challenge or problem that you're currently working to solve in your role. Starting with Alex.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. I work mainly cyber, but is AI part of cyber? Cyber and AI part of information? I'm trying to figure that all out. I mainly work AI and influence operations, like we see the Russians and the Chinese doing. But I'm also, since I do national security work, I'm also looking at weaponization of AI through the use of drones or unmanned underwater vessels and things like that. The two biggest problems I think we have are number one, we've forgotten why democracy is important. Saif talked about progress and prosperity. We've forgotten that democracy has to fight to live, right? Benjamin Franklin, it's a republic if you can keep it, the other thing is that the Russians and the Chinese believe they're at war with us. And so we're just not defending ourselves. And so they're running rampant. Those are the two biggest problems I see.
Thank you. Rachel.
So when Archer when he asked me to be on this panel, I said, "Are you really sure you want me?" Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a lawyer. I work in AI risk management, and I'm helping my clients use AI for labor and employment applications. So whatever the very high level foundation model, democracy, big picture thoughts, I think my day-to-day life is asking my clients about narrow models, about very narrow applications, and trying to mitigate some of the harms and risks that come with that. I feel I used to be embarrassed at my hourly rate, that I would be charging my hourly rate for asking my clients if they've tested the model for bias. And I think the reason why I'm quite busy, and that answer, maybe it surprises you, maybe it doesn't. That's probably part of the discussion on harm.
Awesome. Pedro.
What's interesting at my workplace is the scale at which general models are being released into the wild. Everyone's heard of Llama, I hope, which is a open source foundational model that Meta has released into the world for use, and that has been downloaded hundreds of millions of times by developers building interesting products on top of it. We've released generative AI tools all over our platforms, and I think the latest numbers I saw or read were that our generative AI tools are being used about 500 million times a month, which is by far and away the most used generative AI model on Earth already, even though we came in after some of the original companies you've heard of sort of created the space. So that's fantastic, and we're giving a lot of cool stuff away. The hard problem I'm trying to solve and my team works on is trying to figure out how to create an economic model for monetizing all of this, and paying for the compute power that's necessary to drive it, but also for trying to figure out whether this is profitable or not. And so the monetization of generative AI tools is an interesting piece that I focus on, which is really challenging for a lot of reasons. And the main one being, like, how do you do it responsibly? How do you do it in a way that protects people and preserves their ability to maintain agency and control over their lives? So that's the hardest problem I'm trying to figure out how to work on, not solve. I don't think we're at the solve stage yet, but we're at the problem identification stage.
Hopefully we'll get some more ideas flowing here as well. Iria.
Well, currently I'm working in two areas in which artificial intelligence help play in. One is surveillance systems, looking at the way authoritarian regimes some democratic regimes too, use different kind of technologies for controlling population, and I'm interested in understanding better how the integration of artificial intelligence can increase the potential for digital repression and surveillance and control of the population. That is my more knowledge-based research at the moment, and the second area we're working in is more policy-driven and focus on how Latin America and Africa will play a role in shaping artificial intelligence governance globally, and how those countries are going to be part or no. And that in case it's no, it's going to be a horrible thing for the whole world, of the artificial intelligence revolutions, you want to call it that way.
Thank you. So on some of these global issues, my first question is going to be for Dr. Crowther. So your research primarily focuses on global security and military policy, where many concerns have recently emerged about AI's potential to be used in various tactics of warfare, potential for escalation, etc. In particular, given the dual-use potential of these technologies for both military and civilian purposes, what do you think is the right approach for policymakers to ensure that new technologies are developed in accordance with democratic principles and prevent militarization and avoiding the harms of public safety and civil liberties possibly being violated?
Thanks, Archer. We have this stuff hardwired into our system, starting with the Magna Carta. Saif talked about evidence and things like that. We have the Fourth Amendment. We have the requirement for warrants, all coming from 1215 to today. So we have to keep our eyes on that and make sure that our system is cleaved to as it's developed. And that gets back to the citizenry being involved. Unfortunately, the Russians and the Chinese will sign anything and then proceed to disregard it. Law of the Sea Treaty, we're looking at the Russians in Ukraine. They signed the Budapest Memorandum where the Russians are one of the countries that guarantees Ukrainian sovereignty. And so they're doing the same thing with AI. And so we build people into our AI decision-making cycle, whether it be with cybersecurity or weapon systems on the battleground, because we actually care about things like civilian casualties and making sure that our platforms are not misused. On the other hand, the Chinese and the Russians really don't care who they killed. We're seeing that on a daily basis in Ukraine. And so they're building AI into lethal systems without regard for civilian casualties. It would be very nice if we had global agreements on this, but you could say that the Geneva Conventions say, which the Chinese and the Russians have signed, say that you can't use weapon systems against civilians, but they do anyway. So it's very difficult. We're working on limitations. They're not.
Thank you. I think the most insightful thing that I got from that is kind of highlighting the importance of people, right? Engagement with citizens throughout these processes. You've mentioned having people, particularly in our current weapons development systems, to make sure to be testing them properly, giving their input. And when it comes to managing a lot of the complex chains of accountability, I want to direct the next question to Rachel. So throughout your work in employment and labor law, you've done a lot of very people-focused work, particularly in managing complex chains of accountability between companies, subcontractors, workers, etc. Seeing as a lot of AI systems today are developed in similarly complex fashion, with the process from data collection to model development and deployment, what lessons do you think we can draw for firms to prevent issues such as bias from arising during that process and to ensure better accountability when those issues do arise?
Well, I think the first lesson when we look at our existing civil rights laws is that we have existing laws and principles that make it clear that the employer is responsible for the results. So if you have an employer making an employment decision, whether it's a human process or an algorithmic process, the employer owns that liability. The bot made me discriminate. I didn't understand that the algorithm could discriminate. That doesn't work as an affirmative defense. What our regulatory proposals that we've seen in California actual laws in Colorado and proposals in many states are meant to address some of these supply chain issues, having disclosures between developers and deployers. And understanding that when you have a complex supply chain, you can be both a developer and a deployer as you go up and down that chain. Getting to liability for results, especially results that are far beyond the intended use of a model, or when we talk about foundation models or general purpose AI, I think our regulatory framework needs some maturity on that. And our starting point is, look, my starting point is that if you're an employer trying to use AI to make consequential decisions about people, and right, I'm a lawyer, so all of those limits are important, okay? The fact that you might not understand where the bias and where the risk and what the testing might have been in there, well, ultimately you're owning that liability. And if the vendor is saying, trust us on this, how much can you trust? How much do you trust, and where does that, are you okay with owning that liability?
Awesome. So next I want to direct a question to Pedro, because you've been sort of on the opposite side of dealing with some of these compliance mechanisms, et cetera, representing the corporate perspective in terms of what's going to be feasible for promoting AI innovation while safeguarding democratic standards. So I know that in your work, you've often stressed the need for policies to be well-crafted, understand the challenges that come with developing AI systems, and to balance the need between AI innovation and regulation against harmful uses. So I'm curious, in your opinion, what would you identify as the distinguishing factors between a healthy and well-functioning regulatory system and one that isn't functioning as well as it could be for promoting innovation along with those goals?
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize myself as the opposite side of safety and public security.
No. He makes the regulations.
But I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I just people are listening out there, so I just want to make sure everyone understands. I'm for public safety. Yeah, we're all on the same side, exactly. But I understand what you mean. Look, I think, like, I'm a lawyer. Laws can do different things. Laws can prohibit and stop innovation. They can just stifle it, right? You can design a law that says you can't do that, and that can be something, whatever, X, it can be anything. You can create laws that create incentives for good action, right? The tax code is an example of where it's often used to create conditions where people are incentivized to invest in areas that public policy determines are good. Or you can create, like, retroactive liability, which is if you do the wrong thing, you get punished, right? This is how laws work. All the lawyers in the room know this, and the average citizen understands this if you took a 7th grade civics class. Well, the question is, how do you regulate AI, right? And do so in a way that doesn't stifle innovation, but that still protects people? And the answer is very complicated. You have to do some mix of all three of these things that I just described, and do it in a balanced way that allows technology to flourish and for engineers to experiment so that they can build the most valuable and responsive and productive technologies and tools, but at the same time facilitate frameworks for them to operate within that creates some constraints that are feasible and reasonable, so that they don't experiment radically or in ways that are irresponsible or like per se counter to public policy interests, right? It's art. It's craft work, it's not science, right? And an example of getting this sort of right and wrong to me, and since there's like an energy context to some of this conversation, is like the nuclear proliferation of the 1950s, right? This isn't the first time we've dealt with a new technology that people perceive as dangerous, right? Like when nuclear power came online, there was a lot of hysteria around nuclear weapons, and for all the rightful historical reasons why we understand. And there were all of these incentives in place to ensure that nuclear power came to the world safely. Well, if we look at the evolution of nuclear power, I don't know how many nuclear power plants are online in Europe, but I would argue that there's less today than there were yesterday, and there will be less tomorrow than there are today. And we have to ask ourselves, is that the right trajectory for nuclear power? The United States, it's the same issue. Name the last reactor that came online that drives energy in the United States. Name it. Where is it? Tricky situation that we find ourselves in with increased energy demand, but reduced capacity and infrastructure to meet that demand. And we got there because the types of investments and research that were incentivized in the 50s, 60s, and 70s around nuclear power sort of fell in line around what people called pre-established or I don't remember the fancy energy word, but essentially proven models to deliver energy. But those models were proven from a safety perspective, but maybe not so much from a effectiveness perspective or scalability perspective. And so we disincentivized over time experimentation in nuclear power generation, and essentially are working today on 50-year-old technology. This is what we want to avoid when it comes to AI. So we can look to some historical examples to figure out what not to do, and I think we should.
Thank you. So going a bit deeper on that lane about promoting healthy innovation with regulatory standards, I want to direct this one to you, Iria. So at your work in the Democracy and Tech Initiative, you focused a lot on issues like digital authoritarianism, surveillance, censorship, and repression enabled by AI technologies. And while a lot of this work aims to curb the power of authoritarian actors, a lot of corporations, multinationals, and Western companies have also been implicated in the past in supplying technologies that undermine democratic processes. This included examples like supplying internet blocking technologies in Belarus, disinformation bots being used in the Philippines, and algorithms supporting hate speech in Myanmar and Ethiopia. So within your work through this context, how do you think policymakers can both prevent AI from being weaponized by bad actors and ensure that democratic nations don't unintentionally provide technologies that might contribute further to these harms?
Well, let me try to put this in a context. When we were promoting democratic governance, we tried to look at the environment in which the human rights is put in the center of the process. And for that to happen, you need to have a multi-stakeholder system in which corporations, states, civil society, technical community are part of the conversation. Otherwise, the conversation get uneven and go to one side of the focus. So corporations will focus on a different kind of issues that civil society will do. And what we try to do is to have balanced conversations. So we look at the issues from different point of views and try to find solutions to work for the majority of the population. So that is for starting. In the topics of you are talking about very specific examples of the use of technologies for repression. Not all of them are high-tech interventions. Some of them are very low-tech, like you mentioned Box. Box is something really doesn't need a lot of high capacity technology. But what we are seeing, what we are focusing is the increase of deployment of more comprehensive, what I call command and control system for population control. This is pervasive in authoritarian countries. We know the most common example is everyone quote is China. Venezuela is also a high capacity surveillance systems. We are seeing that increasingly more in other countries in Africa and in Asia. So the so-called smart city projects, the Internet of Things, all those technologies have been utilized by deployment all the issues of biometric recognition, facial recognition. We also see those in very democratic countries here in the United States. Every time you go to an airport, you are subject to facial recognition. So, and that there's a lot of data being there, captured, managed, processed, and decisions are making the data. So that is our focus, how this is happening. One of the issues there is transparency. For instance, in the example of the deployment of biometric recognition in United States airports, it happened silently. 3 years ago, they started to deploy us in airports. There wasn't much ado about that. People still don't know how the capabilities are, what the data is used, what is the details about the data governance. So a lot of these policy issues are about data governance and transparency. What the systems are, how the system process data, where this data is stored, who has access to the data, who made decisions about how data is deployment. Those are the issues we're interested in. So it's no more about, we don't want to focus on an existential danger, but this technology is being deployed and the public doesn't know how it's being deployed. So that for us is that is a major focus of interest. The other focus of interest is how citizens can have an impact in the way these technologies are used. and is in the framework of protecting human rights worldwide, universal human rights, and protecting democratic governance. So that sometimes that part of the conversation is gone. So when we start talking about very specific small issues like, yeah, this particular deep fake, this particular detail, we lost the big picture. And we in the Democracy Project want people to look at the big picture and look at the different point of view about how to deal with these matters, are the implications in the global level and the country level and industrial level. So that is for us part of the conversation. What you say about remediation, what you say how we deal with that, yes, we need policies to do that. For first policies, we need to our policies about data governance, data protection laws we don't have here in the United States, cross borders data transfers. That's another very important issue. So for me, that would be a high level issue we need to solve. Then we had issues more related with how what you mentioned specifically in your question, how companies in Europe, in the United States, Israel is another provider, China is a big provider of technology for repression. How these countries export those repression tools to other countries is a matter which should be subject to sanctions. But we know most of those sanctions are being avoided, and that technology is being sold to African countries, Latin American countries, very widespread deployment. And most of the time, they are not for dual use. They are used for one use, repression.
Thank you, thank you. So going a bit deeper on those themes of repression, digital authoritarianism, and sort of the complex international relationships that make up a lot of the AI supply chain ecosystem, I want to direct back to Dr. Crowther. So a lot of the AI policy debate and landscape today is very heavily framed in terms of strategic competition, security issues, a lot of those things that you focus heavily on. At the same time, there have been some recent calls from both industry leaders as well as experts in the field to begin exploring global cooperative frameworks that include traditional rivals like China and see if we can form a base consensus on regulatory standards, things like the Bletchley Park Summit. At the same time, like we talked about, these technologies are getting exported abroad for undemocratic purposes, and other actors like Russia are actively using AI to support disinformation efforts and other things working directly against democracy. So with these complexities, how do you think that nations can strike the right balance between cooperation and competition? And what's the right playbook for engaging with these actors on base standards without losing sight of our core democratic principles?
So one reason the UN exists is because the League of Nations failed. And one of the reasons the League of Nations failed is because Japan walked out and there was no platform for continued discussion. So even if you disagree with your adversaries, you still need a platform like the UN where everybody can continue to talk. And so the UN, particularly in cyber, has done very well with the group of government experts and the open-ended working group. The big philosophical difference between ourselves and Europe and Japan and Australia versus the Iran-North Korea axis is, as my colleague mentioned, it's multi-stakeholder. We believe that civil society should be involved, that companies should be involved, that international organizations should be involved, whereas they take a multilateral perspective. It's a state-centric perspective. And so what they're doing is they're trying to develop relationships with countries so they can get votes in fora like the United Nations. So the other major disconnect is, as we've all mentioned, is they are authoritarian states, and we are rule of law countries. And several of my colleagues up here have mentioned limitations, right, which are hardwired in from the law. They are rule by law countries, which their legal systems are designed to support the government against the people. Rule of law is to prevent the government from being able to operate against the people. So these are fundamental disconnects, but we need to continue to talk. It took us years. The group of government experts started in 2009. It took till 2015 before we got the Russians and the Chinese to agree that international law does run writ in cyberspace. So this is a huge move forward. Unfortunately, in the 2017 one, they kind of backpedaled on that. And so you can see that an international forum can work, even though we do have fundamental disagreements, and we've got to continue to talk to them, and we've got to continue to build our global partnership, the multi-stakeholder partnership that we've referred to, so that we have enough countries, groups, citizen groups, and businesses agreeing with our liberty-oriented point of view.
Thank you, thank you.
Can I chime in? Go ahead. I got some thoughts too.
Sure. So, I'm going to try to take off my management side lawyer hat here, if I can do that successfully. I think the framing of this discussion does a lot of harm. Because it is extremely difficult to get global consensus on global safety issues. And when you have folks like Sam Altman talking about the risks of AGI and the risks of existential risks from AI, once the global safety consensus and safeguards that we're going to build in on there, it's going to take decades to get to. And in the meantime, we have very real harms, some from narrow AI, some from applications of dual use models, some from just, it's a tool. And you have bad actors, bad state actors, bad non-state actors using a tool for nefarious purposes. For purposes that we feel might violate our ethics. And the fact that we can't get a global consensus, and we're not likely to get a global consensus anytime soon on these issues, I think that is slowing down and harming our ability to progress on finding global consensus or among Western democracies on shared values on things we can agree on. And, I think I'd refer, speaking of Bletchley Park, I'll refer you to Vice President Harris's remarks at Bletchley Park, saying that we should be able to do both of these at the same time.
I agree.
And so, yes, let's talk about the global risks, but the narrow risks, these actual harms, we have to do both.
Thank you. Pedro, I know you had some
Yeah,
thoughts.
look, I think I have a lot of thoughts, so I'm gonna try to gather them here. But there's a convenience to creating an artificial threat that doesn't exist and focusing policy making on that, which is this idea that the generative AIs are going to take over our lives and pour hot coffee on our heads and kill us all. It's just not realistic. It's not founded in science. It's not founded in reality. But it is very convenient because it distracts from real policy making on the actual things that are infringing on people's freedoms and liberties. So that is a problematic sort of framing, to use your language, that I think creates a lot of hysteria and a lot of energy and attention to solve for threats that are just not within the realm of the anytime soon or even realistic. And so we need to actually focus on real risks and real harms and regulate and legislate around those. Secondly, I think there's also this there's this shrouding in the rule of law in the West about how we are the best suited part of the world to decide the future of artificial intelligence because we operate under the rule of law. I think that's interesting perspective, and I understand where it comes from. But I would say that it is also a little bit of a misdirection, because if you just think about the exploitation of AI technologies in Western democracies for surveillance and citizen control, it is at the scale of any of these do-batters that we're pointing out here, just covertly, not overtly. This is the reality of the situation. Like, for example, China has an overt social scoring system, and we all criticize it in every magazine and in every article we write. But the US has an implied social scoring mechanism, which is like TSA and government benefit accessibility and all sorts of things that create similar scenarios for citizens where there's reduction of movement, reduction of access, reduction of rights, but it's not shrouded in overt government action. So like, if we're gonna be honest about having a global dialogue and that dialogue being meaningful, then we have to maintain integrity about all of our actions, including our own, not just pointing fingers. Now, this is not to diminish the fact that I know that there are bad state actors with evil intentions who want to destroy the world and create more oppressive outcomes than what already exists. But if we want to set a good example, we have to govern ourselves accordingly.
Let me add something. First, the three short points. The first one is this conversation about the existential risk of artificial intelligence. I think it's a very Palo Alto, Washington, D.C. conversation. The rest of the world is not paying attention to that conversation. They don't care about that. For most of the world, particularly for African countries, but also for the Caribbean and for Latin America, the existential risk is not being there. So being out of the artificial intelligence technology is the existential risk. All the idea the artificial intelligence is going to take your brains is really Palo Alto thing. Nobody else care about that. Second point, the policy making process and the global conversation about global governance, artificial intelligence is going faster, way faster than any process in regulating technologies I've ever seen. So we had 25 years talking about governance of the internet, and we still had issues. In 2 years, we have made more agreements about artificial intelligence than in 20 years on internet governance. And that is something very, very shocking, particularly considering internet is kind of very technical infrastructure. So there are some very precise ways in which this technology work, while artificial intelligence is a war. There are so many applications. There are so many ways these things are integrated with different industries and even though we are making progress very fast. And the third point is, see, you try to make this a conversation between G7 countries. Is not going to work. So you will have a consensus, and the rest of the world, the overwhelming majority of the world, is going to be doing another thing. So the only way you have an opportunity to build a process in which artificial intelligence can have both safety and innovation and trust and all these things we want it to be is having a global conversation in which most other countries take part. So you try to take out these countries, African countries who are going to be the majority of the users, Latin American countries who already are a high proportion of the users of the technologies in general, you are going to have a policy and regulations nobody is going to be complying with. And that would be very unfortunate.
Thank you, thank you. Gosh, I prepared questions for each of you, but it's great to have more of this discussion. And I think I want to throw another one out there, kind of diving deeper on the issue of integrating diverse countries into these conversations on AI governance. And I'll let whoever wants to go first take a stab at it. So when it comes to integrating particularly global South nations in discussion around AI policy, regulation, as well as democratizing access to these technologies, we all know there's a lot of barriers faced. This can include things like low technological penetration, limitations on how much resources are available in non-English languages, and then trying to balance all of this within a context where there's a lot of global players that are fighting for power. There's a lot of different stakeholders that have different interests. I'm curious, for whoever wants to come forward, what do you think are the biggest lessons that can be learned, or the principles that can help guide us in balancing between those local and global needs and really engaging diverse populations, both with expanding access to AI technology itself and in making sure that these groups are equally participating in conversations around governance so that we can work together to advance these democratic standards?
Well, the global South is underrepresented in our data. And so if we're talking about data sets about people, we just have this fundamental underrepresentation of the global South. And on the U.S. side, when we look at U.S. data about people, I think there is an ongoing concern from folks that there are ways that racial and ethnic minorities are overrepresented in negative data sets and underrepresented in positive data sets. And extrapolating a U.S. or Western European centric view of data or making predictions from those data sets onto a global marketplace, onto global cultures in the global South and Latin America and elsewhere, these are tough problems to solve. I don't know that it's solely a data problem, but it is certainly one that folks are wrestling with.
Awesome.
I think, look, I don't love the term global south, so I'm not gonna use it, but I think like developing countries with developing economies are always left behind. This is the risk that you're flagging, which I agree with very strongly. They're out of the conversation, they're out of the, their governments aren't investing at the same levels as the G7 countries, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to not repeat the same pattern that always happens, they need to be brought in, invited, and considered equal actors in the decision-making process and in the global conversation. But I think like, I was in Mexico just a couple weeks ago speaking to Mexican politicians about this issue, and I'll use Mexico as an example. I think, Mexico has 120 million WhatsApp users, and every WhatsApp user has access to Meta AI. So we can start to begin the path of inclusion in the representation of learning models, because one of the regions that's most quickly adopting our AI tools is South America, is Mexico, for example, is India. These are traditionally left behind demographics that are now sort of first use, right? Now, how do we turn that into something positive and not exploitation? That's the great difficult thing that we need to solve for, right? But government investment by countries like Mexico and Brazil and India in the education and in the usage of AI, particularly generative AI, is going to be a great, in my opinion, would be a great balance maker to ensure that these economies aren't left behind, because they have lots of cool, interesting problems to solve that AI application can really be beneficial for. And then I'll say one last thing. One of the conversations I had in Mexico was around like, should Mexico invest in data center and creating its own models, Mexican AI foundational models? And like my answer to that, somewhat selfishly, but also just somewhat practically, is like, don't do that. Like, we've put out a global model that's free, that anybody can use. We've spent billions of dollars creating it. Just leverage it. Leverage it. Use it for whatever application you want to, but leverage it. Don't try to reinvent the Mexican version of the thing. Just turn the thing we created into the Mexican version of the problem of the solution for the problem you're trying to solve for. So there's lots of opportunity, I think, for developing economies here. It's up to, I think, the governments of those countries to really step in and help guide populations that are usually left behind into this realm.
Thank you. Yes.
Last week, we had a conversation with leaders from governments, academia, and civil society from Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. And precisely one of the things they agree on was they need a specific data set built for them, by them, to address the issues they care about. So they were pretty much interested in developing their own talents, developing their own resources, and creating small, no large language models to address very specific issues they had. That was particularly a high priority issue for small island countries, for the Caribbean countries, for the Southeast Asia countries. So they really are at the opposite side of what you're saying, and that is their view. I think we should have a conversation, because this is what they want. And they want the voluntarily, they don't want to continue to be consumers of technology developed in the United States or developed in China. So they want resources for developing their own technologies for their own aims. And that is an important part of the conversation. How you develop talents, how you develop the infrastructure, how you create. One of the things we are hearing a lot is big companies wanted to build data centers in Africa. African countries had issues with energy, had issues with water. So you are going to put data centers there who is going to take all these resources, natural resources they had, and they are not going to be part of the knowledge, the innovation, the case use for that technology. Just that you're only recipients of technology developed for other aims in other countries, and providers of natural resources for those processes to continue to serve European, United States, or China, or Russia interests. And they really don't want that.
I do worry about, I've gotten that same type of feedback by Latin American countries, and I worry about whether that's misguided or not. And the reason for that is just the high cost of adoption and high investment barrier to building these unique crafted models versus just fine tuning larger models.
Yeah,
I
but
know.
this is what they want. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
need to have that conversation,
Yeah,
how to put resources for that to happen.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we have to go a very divided world, and it's going to be very unstable and very insecure.
I think Dr. Crowther has some thoughts. I'll let you give kind of some final remarks on this issue, and then we'll move to taking some questions for the audience after this. I do as well have one final question that's going to be directed towards all panelists, but that's going to be after some audience Q&A so that we can incorporate some of the further discussion, insights, et cetera, into your ending takeaways. So, Dr. Crowther.
So I'm a cyber advisor overseas, and one of the first things I say is I'm not here to impose an American model. I'm here to help you think through your problems to create a solution for your situation, because every country is different. Multi-stakeholder is super important. Remember, we have to have civic society here, but when we talk about representation for all the different countries, you've got the Organization of American States, you've got LACNIC, which is a tech-centric one for the Western Hemisphere. So we just have to make sure we keep multi-stakeholder in mind here so that everybody's got a seat at the table. And my last comment on this is we should ensure that my personal opinion, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should be involved in this whole discussion as kind of like, not necessarily the rule set, but ensuring that different countries, they can go in different directions. They can take the same model and go wherever they want with it, but please let's cleave to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're going to open up the floor for some questions, both from our live audience as well as from the live stream audience. We do have someone that will be monitoring the chat questions and answering any that come up so that we can get those represented. And then, yeah, I think we can definitely continue to have some of the back and forth, getting some multiple perspectives on these questions. And then I do have a final thing that I'm going to ask you all at the end so that we can wrap up the session a little bit before going on to some closing remarks. So, who's got some questions for our panelists? Yes.
I have a couple. We started with the conversation about the California, 1057, is that what it was called? And I'm interested in why Elon Musk supported it on one hand, and on the other, one of the reasons for the veto was the critique that there was not a distinction between high-risk segments of AI and, if you will, low risk, and that it was really much more of a blanket set of rules and regulations. I'd be curious about how the panelists see that part of the critique of the veto.
Pedro?
Lawyer.
Or lawyer? Yes, Rachel? I know both of you have done some pretty
Both
similar work in
lawyers.
space for risk analysis and differentiating there. So if either of you want to take a stab.
No, they don't want, but they should.
I think that the governor's veto talks on 1047 talks about balancing, the need to innovate against, chilling. What are we actually requiring for safety testing, and how is what 1047 would have imposed additive to what the big tech companies have already agreed to do in agreement with the Biden administration versus, what are we actually testing for? What are we actually when we say we're going to disclose AI red teaming results to the federal government and maybe to the California State AG? What are they going to do with that? How does this actually advance the ball? So, I think that some of the objections to 1047 were that, well, how is this actually promoting safety? And is that juice worth the squeeze, the regulatory squeeze on imposing and a framework, a testing and safety framework that wasn't very well defined?
Look, I think Elon Musk moved his headquarters out of California, so there's probably some of that going on in there in his sort of like competitiveness decision to support it. But I think the two things that, and maybe you disagree with me, but I think the two things that derailed this bill were like this kill switch idea, which I just don't think is feasible or realistic. It's not a real thing. And then the way it regulated foundational models. It really just was going to regulate 4 or 5 companies. It wasn't going to create a level playing field. And so I think those two dimensions are probably what tanked it. And the spirit of Newsom's veto was not AI should not be regulated. It was we need proportionate, reasonable regulation that fosters innovation and creates safeguards. And this particular bill, in the governor's view, and I guess I would argue in my own, did not do that in the right balance. So he vetoed it.
Thank you. Further questions? Do we have any online audience as well? Not yet? All right. Yes. And if you can introduce yourself as well.
Let me try one. So I'm Chetan Baru. I'm a senior advisor at the National Science Foundation. So this question probably goes to this concept of what are the real risks as opposed to the Palo Alto DC risks that you mentioned. I find myself in a lot of these. I go to a lot of these kind of meetings, obviously nowadays, and a lot of times it's about sort of the use of AI, consumption of AI. But there's also the manufacture of AI side of it, right? And the whole supply chain that goes to the manufacturer. On one side, it's data streams, but on the other side, it's the big machines. And you mentioned large data centers that get placed in different places and so on. And the large data centers have chips in them, and the chips come from somewhere. So I'm wondering if, whether it's Facebook, etc., so I don't know how much of you make your own chips in the US or whatever. What do you see as the real risks on the manufacturing side of AI?
I just saw an article yesterday that said TSMC in Arizona has surpassed the TSMC plant in Taiwan for manufacturing. So it's very important from a national security perspective. Buying electronics from China is probably a bad idea. And, you know, there's a million lines of code in the F-35. Who knows who's snuck what in there? So I believe in a domestic, we need a domestic hardware and software industry that we can trust.
I think the risk is like multidimensional. I agree with you on the like geopolitical risk to the US of like where chips are manufactured and by whom. I mean, I think we've got some advantages in NVIDIA and AMD and then Intel obviously have manufacturing presence in the US and overseas that can leverage, but the design and engineering of the chips is happening mostly here, which I think is from the perspective that you just shared, agreeable, right? And I think it's obviously meaningful to US national security. I think the other piece is climate impact, right? Like an environmental impact of just the amount of minerals necessary to drive all of the computation, and then the resource demands of data centers on water and on the grid. These are going to be existential risks, not just economically, but from a security perspective as well, that we're going to have to manage as in the U.S. But to the points made earlier, in the developing nations are even more great, like particularly on the energy capacity side. If they want to go independent and build their own uniquely tailored models, just like the energy demands of that, it's going to be really hard if you're on a little small island in the Caribbean.
AI hits all three components of ESG, and I think we're here in DC, you know, Northern Virginia data centers are being powered by West Virginia coal plants that are way past the end of their life. We lost our moderator.
Hey, we can take questions without a moderator. Go ahead.
My question is really around human capital and it's connected to national security. And I'll sort of start with Alex and then love the insights of the other co-panelists. But how concerned are you when we think about American competitiveness around sort of the underlying, if you'd want to call it the calculus gap, that in order to make competitive play as a computer scientist, you needed to have done certain forms of math in high school, and we're slipping very, very far behind. Obviously, American innovation is kind of unrivaled at one end of the spectrum, right? Kind of the MIT, Berkeley axis that's creating engineers at one level, but there's a base pool of engineering talent that we're losing, which one could draw kind of a parallel to infantry in the military, where we know that there's a range of issues, including like obesity, et cetera, that we don't have enough young bodies that qualify to go into our infantry pool. And so that's causing a challenge for American sort of national security. How concerned are you around that sort of calculus gap, how it shows up for engineering talent, and what that means for sort of us sort of the American innovation machine moving forward?
So the innovation machine is not just education, it's also businesses and stuff like that. When I first started getting into cyber power, I noticed the Dutch kept popping up and I wondered why, and it's the ecosystem. They have an education system, and then they have the international businesses, and they're in the EU and things like that. And so our ecosystem is unmatched. I think probably we make enough engineers, but a lot of them go home, which calls for major updating of our immigration system. I think all these Chinese and Indian and everybody else that comes here to study engineering, we should incentivize them to stay here.
Retain talent, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, people talk about a brain drain overseas. We actually have a brain gain in the United States of America. Our immigrants are powerful, powerful influence. We just need to motivate them to stay. Many are motivated to stay, but we kick them out. And so I believe our ecosystem is working. It would be nice if we created more engineers. It would be nice if we admitted that cyber and AI is not all about engineers. We need soft science people to be in AI, to be in engineering, and it gives totally different perspectives. It's a different perspective of diversity, right? You need to have soft science people in here as well, and that will also grow your pool of people that are good at this.
I think
Push
your-
a little bit more on
So-
that.
Sorry, it's just real quick, like, I think your analogy of infantrymen is interesting. I was in the service too, for whatever that's worth, but like, there's a term in the military called force multiplier, right? And like, one thing is add soldiers. Another one is make that soldier better,
Yep.
right? And I think the same applies in engineering, okay? Like, do we need armies of, I hate military analogies for corporate world, but do we need to increase our capacity for engineering? Yes. Is it more important to make sure we have the best engineers with the best tools and the best equipment and the most resources? I think that's actually more important. Because one well-suited, I don't know what the right word, I don't know the weapons analogy here, but like one engineer with all the right tools is much more powerful than 100 engineers in a dark room, right? Like, this is what I'm suggesting. And so I think like investing around the talent that we do have to make sure that it has the optimal conditions to continue to innovate, build, and design.
The ecosystem.
Yeah,
So
all
we-
the stuff around it, I think
Yeah.
is just as important and quite frankly, easier than changing the immigration code, which has all the political challenges that we have, which I agree we should, but like, you know, just like,
See, you read the National Security Memorandum which just came out, you will learn the thinking is not about improving education in the United States. Nobody is talking about calculus in high school. They are talking about immigration. They are talking about attracting to the United States the best and the brightest of the world. But as I mentioned, in the meetings I had last week, with people from Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean, they were exactly in the opposite side. They were talking about retaining their talent. They were talking about having to get resources for keeping the talent. They are talking about regulations forcing companies to pay the talent they had in those countries at the same level they are paying those same profiles in Europe or United States, so they stay there. So we are going to clash because the United States is the only solution United States wants for talent development is getting talent from Latin America, Africa, India, whatever, any country, Europe, Asia Pacific, whatever other country had developed those talents. And those countries say, we are not letting our talent go. We want the resources to be invested in us. This is a no-go, and somebody's going to lose. Probably everybody's going to lose.
I cyber advise on 3 different continents, and everybody I talk to has the same complaint, and they name the United States and Germany as the 2 places that poach all the talent.
We have a question back here.
Yes.
I think you had your.
Oh, yeah. Actually, sorry, yeah, that was kind of to follow up on that. So I'll ask my question first and then give some context about it. So I guess the question is, what might the government do to better engage with professional societies to address AI ethical concerns? And so the background to this, and so it touches on the keynote and then some of the discussions that have taken place since then. So like historically, when you look at like nuclear power, if you look at nanotechnology, if you look at other emerging technologies that have posed these kind of similar issues to AI, there's a lot of engagement from professional societies, whether that be so material science, energy, so on and so forth, and that's so. Even things like medicine, medical regulations. So I appreciate the point about politicians in the United States and most of them not studying engineering. Does anyone know what most politicians in China have studied?
Engineering.
Yes, all of them have studied engineering, and it's not necessarily a great thing, you know? Like, so one of the things that's unique about the United States maybe versus China is the fact that you have a vibrant civic society that contributes to policymaking and stuff like this through the professional associations, right? So things like the American Society for Mechanical Engineering, IEEE, things like this. And one of the things that, I mean, this is what I think about a lot is with regard to the development of AI, the field itself is so much more fragmented than other fields might be historically. So you have people from different places on the one hand, and different places not geographically, but different disciplines on the one hand. And then because a lot of it has emerged out of Silicon Valley, there's a disdain for tradition, right? So you wanna venture out on your own. You don't want professional formation versus civil engineering, again, chemical engineering, things like this. And so, I don't know, that's what I think about, like what might government do to better engage with professional societies to craft regulation?
There's a great, my favorite line of a lawmaker talking about AI is Senator Kennedy. He was interviewed by like John Oliver's folks at one point, and the question was, Senator, does Congress have the technical knowledge to regulate AI? And the senator goes, well, the short answer is no, and the long answer is, oh, hell no. And he does it in the New Orleans, Louisiana drawl. I think there's a lot of messaging bills out there. And when you look at aptitudes on the Hill and understanding, staff's understanding of what does this regulation actually change, what behavior does it change, how does this relate to how applications are being developed and deployed in the real world, there is a disconnect there. And when we look at state legislatures, so right now I think the next legislative frontier for next spring will be in the state legislators. There's multiple state legislatures which will be taking a swing at broad and narrow AI regulation, and having industry go in and say, you can't be serious. This doesn't actually jive with how we're deploying an application or the ways that the vendors are selling, deploying, suggesting we should be using these models. And they'll say, do you intend this law to include asking, ChatGPT or Llama a question that you rely on or you rely in part on? Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. How does that actually behave in the real world? And how does that regulatory process stack up against our desire to be competitive?
Mm-hmm.
No easy answers.
I know we want to take some more questions. I think we had one from the online audience.
Yes.
And then we'll go back just to ensure that everyone gets a chance to speak. And then at the end, we will also have more of an opportunity to engage with some of the panelists on some policy discussion a little bit later. But yes, online question.
So online user Totaka is asking, how can international organizations provide stronger regulation over harmful uses of AI abroad for certain oppressive regimes or military use? As an example, how the US is starting work with OpenAI in Africa.
Yeah, context. The OpenAI announced, the Insider reported 2 days ago that a new contract was established between OpenAI, the US government, in Africa for AI and military purposes. So I think that's going back to some of the questions about, militarization, supporting healthy use of these dual use technologies, and international organizations, I believe was the second thing they mentioned, right? So I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts, not just on that specific situation, but in general about a lot of the companies that we're seeing are increasingly making their way into military and other contexts? And what are your thoughts on how we can balance those purposes? I know Crowther spoke a little bit on this, if you want to add more, or if anyone else has some more thoughts to add as well.
So, it depends on whether or not you want to use AI on a weapon system or whether you want to use AI to run your military better, to improve your governance. And really, when we talk about the threat to democracy, we're threatened by AI, generative AI information operations, but at the same time, we're empowered by AI in improving our democratic processes. And so you got to balance that out, and there's not a whole lot of AI weapon systems mixing going on. There's experimentation with it. I'm of the opinion that most AI used in defense departments, ministries of defense and things like that are process improvement AI as opposed to killing people better.
Making better PowerPoint decks.
There you go.
I do think that a lot of like international governance around like the deployment of weapon systems is largely ceremonial. This is my take. Like, you know,
I agree with that.
yeah, warfare governance is self-governance. You decide as a war-fighting nation or a war fighter, whether it be the nation collectively or the war fighter individually, what your ethic is in battle. You don't look to the enemy to tell you what it is. I can assure you, I know you agree with me on that. And so, like, I think a lot of it is very nice to do about nothing. Now, as a free, law-abiding society, you have to decide how you're going to self-govern yourself. But I think, and that should be inclusive of input from others, but ultimately your destiny is your own, I think, in the context of conflict and conflict preparation. And that's been proven since they invented the first piece of AI technology in warfare, which I would argue is the booby trap.
I think there's one more online, and then we'll go over here.
So what are some next steps being taken towards maintaining sustainability as AI expands, such as how AI data centers require quadruple the water it takes to cool down compared to traditional data centers? I'm not sure.
I mean, I can speak a little bit to this. Like, there is a tremendous amount of research, innovation, and investment in data center efficiency at my company and at all of the competitors. And there's obvious reasons for that. The cheaper the energy is, the more you can use it. You know, the better it is for the environment, the more you can use it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think government action is necessary. I think what we saw maybe 10 years ago was this appetite by lots of regional and local politicians to have data centers in their neighborhoods, or not neighborhoods, but in their regions. Nobody wants a data center in their neighborhood, even though I live literally across the street from one. But but what we're seeing is a little bit of transition there, where people realize they're not real job creators, they're not real economic engines for the places in which they are in, and so we're gonna have to solve for some of these problems. I'm not sure. Look, the answer to that question is there's a lot of investment and a lot of work being done to make them better, faster, and more environmentally friendly. Excuse me, more efficient and more environmentally friendly. What that plays out as, I'm not sure, but my guess is that over time, data centers will require less power for more compute and will be more economically friendly because all the conditions exist for that to be true.
All right, I know we had some questions over here. Yes, you had a second one, and then we'll go to you as well.
Right, I wanted to connect some dots, and I see that Saif is left, but let me just point out what I think is a contradiction, and maybe some of you figured that out as well, in terms of his presentation and what you're saying. And that is that while he's talking about democratization and essentially opening up input into AI, you all are saying we need better and more technical expertise. And in some respects, opening up our political system is antithetical to more and better expertise on one hand. And then the issue of professional societies is very important, because professional societies, particularly for advanced training, set standards and essentially create, if you will, barriers to entry. Now, there's a good reason for that. There's a very good reason for that on one hand. But on the other hand, we have a lot of interest in domains that professional societies govern that students can't get into or through because of the standards that are set up, which are essentially based on, if you will, looking in a rearview mirror and understanding what happened 10, 15, 20 years ago and how that should be governed, okay, as we go forward. So I think at one level, they're interested in protecting what they have and less interested in the innovation and the forward-looking challenges that those professionals are supposed to be addressing.
Rachel, I mean, I got you on this panel because of a connection through a sort of professional society, the For Humanity AI Audit Group.
I'm not a member of that group, and
One of the people was able to connect with the people. But I know that you have done a lot of work in terms of professional relations through EEOC, NLRB, your current legal work, et cetera. I'm curious what your perspective might be on some of this, and then if some others want to.
I think that the financial interest in a lot of these groups, is, well, hey, if we could have some audit standards that we can pay folks to license and to use, there's pecuniary interests, at stake there. If you think about coding and, are we organizing our coders? Is there a professional society of Python developers or data scientists? I don't think that's what you're asking us for, but like the, IEEE, on my end, the SIOP, the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists, these are professional organizations that have, well, here are some standards that we hope people adhere to, and maybe if people don't adhere to these standards, they've fallen short of a duty of care, of some sort of duty of care. But I think just the maturity of our ability to hold people to these standards, or for a regulator to hold people to these standards, or say this is the audit standard that we want people to adhere to. And there are proposals on the Hill about AI auditing. And I think, the folks drafting the legislation on AI auditing really don't understand what's going into an AI audit. And I think part of the challenge is we have moving targets on, are we auditing a foundation model for some of these existential risks, or, NBC risks, or, what are we actually looking at? We don't have consensus.
Iria, I'm curious if you might have some perspectives as well. I know the first part of your question was about that democratizing access to AI and getting like non-technical professionals involved here. A lot of times these same professional organizations will also maybe not be inclusive of diverse global communities. So I know you've done a lot of work on AI in different countries, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, you've mentioned. What do you think can be learned from those experiences of engaging both technical and non-technical groups, civil society, et cetera, in the development of AI, sort of like the question was talking about?
We're not talking here about the development of the AI, we are talking about the development of policy for the AI ecosystem. And in that regard, we had the experience of the Internet Governance System, with its multi-stakeholder in which governments, private companies, technical communities, civil society have been participating for many years. And that is a model that may work for the governance of artificial intelligence. And of course, you don't need to be a coder for be part of the conversations. Sometimes when people think not knowing about AI, people are thinking about the programming of this, and the program is a part. We already mentioned the issues of the hardware. We mentioned the issues of trade. We mentioned the issues of data governance, the issues of education for the workforce. So all those issues are part of the conversation when we are talking about policy. And there's people who have different knowledge, different skills, who can be part of that conversation. One of the things in what you had in those multi-stakeholder space is that you had to share that knowledge. So there would have to be a common ground of what is a requirement for being part of a specific conversation. And there is going to be different people at the table when we are talking about standards, for technical standards for some kind of technical process, what we are talking about, how we assess risk, how we store data, how make decisions about data, that would be different conversation. In each of one of those conversations, there would be different people in the table, but there had to be people from different sectors in those terms, of different communities with different stakeholders, but also had to be people from different countries, so it had a different part of the world. So that is what we talk about when we talk about having a multi-stakeholder space. It can be democratic, it can be a place in which we share different knowledge. It doesn't mean everybody is a specialist and specifically the same kind of thing, because this is affecting many issues. It's political, it's economic, it's technical, and all these issues have to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. I know we had a question here as well.
So Aria actually led right into what I was going to say, but I'll see if I can take that a little further, because what I keep coming back to, and which has come across in multiple conversations I've had recently, the AI and democracy conversation is actually a lot of different conversations, right? And it can be very hard when you get people in the room to try and even keep it in one place or follow one thread all the way through. And I think in that regard, I'd like to maybe reverse something that was said during the keynote, which is, okay, there's an issue, and certainly this is something, again, I hear kind of globally that people are concerned about, with a lack of familiarity with the technical specifications of AI and other emerging technologies, really, in legislatures, in other branches of government, for sure. But there is also the fact that people who are just experts on AI, right, on the technical side of AI, don't necessarily have all of the expertise to address the other domains that are coming up. So just in this conversation, there's a conversation that's about supply chain. So people who know geopolitics and geoeconomics are most familiar in that conversation. There's a conversation about AI and discrimination. And so people who know anti-discrimination law and the social dynamics in a particular country are going to be most familiar with that conversation. There's a conversation about public investment. And so I think this also kind of means maybe we should be realistic about how much can be done in any sort of one set of rules or principles for AI. I think it's important to have those rules and principles to address specific things like the black box problem, right, that are very specific to developing advanced AI models. But at the same time, I wonder if there's a sort of natural diffusion of the sites of decision making that's going to happen, because again, there are some things, there's norms of transparency, there's things like, for instance, I think we can agree that it's bad, as we've seen from some PRC companies, to have technical standards that allow the automatic detection of members of the Uyghur minority in China and facial recognition cameras, right? Those are things that happen at the development level. But then, all right, we have facial recognition cameras, and they can be used in a lot of different ways. They can be used in a very limited way in law enforcement context and rule of law settings, or they can be exported to countries where you get arrested for going to a protest, as we've seen facial recognition cameras used in Russia. Right, and so that's not really a question about how do you develop the cameras per se. It's the same technology. It's about where can we export them, and there's the export control people who need to make those decisions. And so how can we have this, what can be done to break down the silos between these different sectors and facilitate an all of society conversation, which maybe it's not just necessarily about, okay, everyone in the country is kind of submitting input into a dialogue about a big piece of legislation on the model of the EU AI Act, but it's actually thinking about how AI is used in your professional field, in your area of focus, which I think is actually going to affect people pretty much all across society.
I'll let whoever wants to start stab at that.
Well, I will start. That is pretty much what we do in the Democracy Plus Tech initiative. Try to bridge those silos, different conversations, so through small consultations. So we do that constantly, and we try to help policymakers to advance based on the input we receive from different stakeholders. So that's for us, it's a continuous process to have these consultations with different stakeholders from different sectors and from different countries. But that is kind of a small level, a small scale as effort. For this to be an impact in global policymaking, it had to be a global process. So it had to be that those inputs had to be in all those processes. For instance, the work we were doing last week is going to inform the French AI summit. So that take a higher level. Now we had the conversations about the Global Digital Compact. We had a huge component about artificial intelligence, and that had to, we hope, and us with a large process, an established process like the internet governance, for the governance, or artificial intelligence. So people think part of this conversation, particularly what is the data governance, had to interlock with conversations about trade. Trade fairness. So there is spaces in the global level. United Nations want to be part of that conversation. Actually, not everybody is very happy with that creation of artificial intelligence governance body as a part of the United Nations, but it's an ongoing conversation about. And I think we need to continue to look for better places in which we can have something like the Internet Governance Forums for artificial intelligence, or even expanding the Internet Governance Forums and getting something is more about the different technologies we are dealing with right now.
So I got some bad news for you. We can't even get Americans to not click on the link. Basic cyber hygiene, okay? We can't get Americans to understand the election cycle and the system. And so I'm afraid AI is just a bridge too far in terms of the ability to get the American person to understand them. Ideally, in our schools, somebody talked about civics class in 7th grade. I don't know that they do that anymore. And so our school system should be familiarizing our students with AI and cyber and influence and things like that. Not everybody needs a PhD in this stuff, but at least they need to, don't click on the link, right? The basic building blocks of the use of information, the responsible use of information, and we just aren't there yet.
I think it's very easy to blame the user, and I agree, we need to do better. But there's a lot of technological innovation that can protect people that needs to happen. I don't think it's fair to ask the single mother with 2 jobs and 3 kids to be 100% mindful of every aspect of her internet experience. It's just too much to ask for a lot of people, and it's particularly a lot of Americans. The same goes for developing countries. You're worried about people's ability to read and write. Link hygiene is going to be really hard to get. So I think companies like mine have a big responsibility to ensure that we're investing aggressively on safeguards and on guardrails that protect people, so that they are actually a safety net for themselves versus the first line of defense, which is kind of where a lot of people are right now.
And I think, as we've seen with other security domains, the answer really is a combination of both. Why not both? Why not better technical safeguards and guardrails and better user and population education?
Absolutely.
And I think that
Holistic approach.
Absolutely.
Yes.
The conversation about misinformation and disinformation and how that is a fundamental threat to our democracy. We haven't really had as much of that here. And how do you educate people about all of these issues? It's dangerous. It's tough.
So I know we're running a little bit close on time, so I've got one final question that I'm going to ask to all of the panelists to wrap up our discussion. So as we're talking about, there are so many different subcategories of these conversations on AI and democracy, so many different stakeholders that need to be engaged, and it's really a matter of, there's a lot of will to make some sort of policy, but it's difficult to identify what the policy is. And while I'm sure that there's no single answer that solves all of the problems that we've talked about today perfectly, what I'm curious is, for each of you guys, sort of a takeaway, if you could snap your fingers right now and have one change enacted or policy made at any level of governance, private institutions, etc., if you could identify one thing as a priority to work in solving these problems, what your key recommendation would be? Starting with Dr. Crowther.
We have to educate our legislators. There's got to be some sort of platform to just sit them down for half a day and talk to them about all of this stuff. Right? So it's the responsible use of information, which a subset is AI. Because right now, no offense to my colleagues up here, but the tech sector is driving this, which is good in some ways, there are responsible members of the tech sector, and then there are other members of the tech sector who are just out for money or influence or whatever. And so, given the multi-stakeholder approach, the tech sector has to be involved but can't be the dominant actor. And so legislation is a lagging indicator certainly in cyber, and it's not even on the table when it comes to AI.
We didn't plan this. My answer is not just educating the legislatures, but the corporate decision makers.
Yep.
Not necessarily at the tech companies that are the AI developers, but the folks who are using AI in all of these wide domains that we're talking about here. I think corporate decision making on AI risk is still fragmented. There are some that are trying to get their arms around it and put in these governance structures and think about how do I test, how do I validate, all of these questions that there's the technical risk, there's the application risk, there's what are your users and customers going to do with it? And I think the need for education at the decision maker level, whether it's executive, management, or folks, in the trenches, I think still is really acute.
You said magic wand, right? Yeah. Okay, so, I think the United States is uniquely positioned right now to set a global example if we can get our act together. Europe has shown us, in my view, how not to regulate AI, and the evidence of that is in companies like Meta and Apple withdrawing product launches in Europe of perfectly reasonable products like the Automoto AI in these glasses because of the heavy regulatory unpredictability and just difficulty of launching a product in that region. So that to me is like not a good regulatory outcome. The challenge in the U.S. is what I see for AI is somewhat of what we've seen in privacy and in cyber. Like if you think data breach legislation in the United States, no national standard, 50 some odd different rules across the country creates expensive chaos for everyone, including people and the victims of cybercrime. Privacy, no federal privacy law creates privacy chaos around the country from a regulatory standpoint. Increased costs, doubtful if it protects anybody more so than if we have federal law. I think for AI, the same is true. And I would love to see a moment where the United States rises to the occasion and incorporates some of the ideals that I've heard everybody here share about what good laws look like and set a global example.
I'm not very fan of magical solutions. I never liked them. But see, had to pick one single thing who is achievable, it would be a data protection. Data protection law, I think, will help to get us to actionable conversations about how to manage data for artificial intelligence, for social media, for healthcare, who is something that's really horrible what happened here with the medical data in the United States. So all those issues can be handled if we had a good process for coming out with a data protection legislation, which is something this country really needs urgently.
Thank you. So I'd like everyone to give a hand for our wonderful panelists. And I know Mike Asensio has some closing remarks.
How about another hand for our panelists, and especially for Archer, what a fantastic job pulling this off. This speaks a lot to the caliber and the quality. We're so proud of our students and their ability to orchestrate and create. We're just happy to support these initiatives. With that said, I also want to invite all of you for lunch downstairs in the first floor so we can continue some of these conversations. I think there will be a photo opportunity as well for our panelists and Archer, if we could do it downstairs on the way out. But we would like you to join us for lunch downstairs. And once again, thank you all for making the time to come out here in person. And for those of you online as well, we're very appreciative for you logging on, and we will be sharing this, and there will be more to come at some point. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Don't worry, I had a couple. Wait.